the Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, for a month, Conservatives have been warning the government about rising tensions in Nova Scotia. This morning, the Minister of Public Safety compared the current situation to a war zone in need of peacekeeping. The government has ignored this issue. The Minister of Fisheries has refused to take her responsibility to Indigenous and commercial fishermen seriously. And now, instead of sending in negotiators a month ago, the government has to send in police officers. Mr. Speaker, when will the minister finally do her job before more people get hurt?
Yeah.
Honourable Deputy Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, let me join the Leader of the Official Opposition, and I think all members of this House, and indeed the vast majority of Canadians, in condemning the appalling violence that has taken place. Federal and provincial ministers are working together on solutions to maintain the peace and avoid any further violence. I'm sure we all agree on the need for all parties to engage in respectful dialogue aimed at upholding the Marshall Decision and the Mi'kmaq Treaty right to fish while ensuring conservation and sustainability of the fishery.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, leadership means acting before people get hurt. Ce gouvernement choisit.
This government always picks the wrong decision in leadership, the worst option. In Nova Scotia, the situation is increasingly serious because this Prime Minister and the Minister take action very slowly. For months, the Conservatives have been asking for mediation. Today, it's the police who are on the ground. Will the Minister of Fisheries have the leadership to resolve this issue, or will we still have to wait? The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, we condemn the terrible violence that has taken place. The federal and provincial ministers are working together on solutions to maintain peace and avoid any new violence. It is essential for all parties to be respectful and respect the Marshall Decision, as well as the Mi'kmaq Treaty, while ensuring the conservation and sustainability of the fishery. The Honourable Leader of the Opposition. Mr. Speaker, another week, another provocation from China, and like always, it's the government, the Liberal government has the status quo. The Chinese ambassador threatened the 300,000 Canadians living in Hong Kong. It's worse today because the Chinese government has said that Canada must apologize. Will the Prime Minister finally protect Canadians and stand up to China? The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, our position on human rights and freedoms, freedom of expression, is quite clear. As with regard to the situation in Hong Kong, the Minister of Foreign Affairs took measures to clarify and share Canada's official position on the ambassador's comments. And I would highlight that the government's decisions when it comes to immigration will be taken only by Canada. The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Speaker, as this government is too timid to act. Last week, the Chinese ambassador threatened 300,000 Canadians currently living in Hong Kong. He has offered no public apology, and this government hasn't demanded one. This morning, we learned that the Chinese government has actually doubled down and are complaining about our reaction to their threat. Mr. Speaker, will the government finally demand that the Chinese ambassador apologize to Canadians publicly in the same way that he publicly threatened them?
Well, Deputy Prime Minister.
Let me be very clear. Our government is clear and outspoken in our defense of human rights and free speech in Canada and around the world. That is why we have been steadfast in defending the protests in Hong Kong and the 300,000 Canadians who live there, and in protesting the treatment of the Uyghurs. And let me just say, the recent comments by the Chinese ambassador are not in any way in keeping with the spirit of appropriate diplomatic relations between two countries. And let me also add that Canada's decisions will be made by Canadians.
Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, the only thing that remains clear is this Prime Minister's continued admiration for the basic dictatorship in China. This morning, the Chinese ambassador took his comments a step further. He's issued another vague threat against Canada if Parliament dares to condemn the ethnic cleansing against Muslim Uyghurs in Western China. Canadians in Hong Kong have been threatened. This House has now been threatened, Mr. Speaker. Who else has to be threatened by the ambassador before the Prime Minister is willing to pull his credentials?
Well, Deputy Prime Minister.
Let me be very clear. I am well aware of the character of authoritarian communist regimes. I have lived in one and reported on it. And let me also be clear that when it comes to the treatment of the Uyghurs, an ethnic Muslim minority which is being persecuted, Canada will always speak out clearly and without any reservation. And let me also assure the Canadians, the 300,000 Canadians in Hong Kong, that a Canadian is a Canadian is a Canadian, and we will stand with them.
The Honourable Member for La Prairie. Mr. Speaker, the government is committed to ensuring we don't get to the bottom of the Wee scandal that is prepared to fall, if need be, if there's a vote on creating a special committee on the issue. In the middle of a pandemic and the second wave, it's threatening the opposition parties with going to an election because it doesn't want to hear about the Wee Charity anymore. This summer, they shut down Parliament so we would stop talking about the Wee Charity, and now it's prepared to have an election to make us stop talking about it. It's very worrying. What do they have to hide? The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, we are facing a global pandemic which has created the greatest economic crisis since the Second World War. It is important for MPs to look at the government's expenditures, and that is why the Leader of the government in the House proposed a reasonable solution to his counterparts to start the work. I hope that all the parties will work together in order to find a reasonable way forward. The Honourable Member for La Prairie. Mr. Speaker, the Liberals want to create a COVID costing committee. We fully agree with that. We're talking about $300 billion, but they gave $912 million to an organization that left Canada once it lost the contract. There are so many questions about it, but we can do both at the same time instead of threatening the opposition parties. Why don't they accept the creation of a committee that will look in full at the Wee Charity? The Deputy Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, let me remind you of the facts. More than 5,000 pages of the document were provided to the Committee of Finance. The Prime Minister made public today his honorariums. His chief of staff and other officials have appeared before the committee to testify on the issue. Mr. Speaker, that is transparency. The Honourable Member for Burnaby South.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Liberal and Conservatives have failed the Mi'kmaq. And now the Mi'kmaq are facing violence, crime, and intimidation. At the same time, the Prime Minister is standing by. When will the Prime Minister protect the Mi'kmaq and their constitutional rights and put an end to violence? The Deputy Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the member for this very important question. Our government strongly condemns the violent actions that have recently taken place in Nova Scotia. We have approved a request for assistance from the province in order to increase our RCMP officers as needed. These acts of violence will be investigated fully, and those responsible will have to answer for their actions.
South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This isn't a new problem. The government has known about this problem for decades, and both conservative and liberal governments have failed the Mi'kmaq people. And as a result, we've all seen the horrible images of fires being set to facilities, traps being cut, intimidation, and assault. Now, while all this has happened, the Prime Minister has stood by idly and not acted. Leadership is stepping up. When will the Prime Minister step up, protect the Mi'kmaq people, their constitutional right, and end the violence?
The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, let me just thank the member opposite for the question and say I very much agree with him that Canada has, for decades, for centuries, failed the Indigenous people in Canada, and it is time for us to put this right. We condemn the appalling violence that has taken place, and let me say I believe the vast majority of Canadians feel exactly that way. I think we all also agree on the need for all parties to engage in respectful dialogue aimed at upholding the Marshall Decision and the Mi'kmaq Treaty right to fish while ensuring the conservation and sustainability of the fish.
Well, it seems reasonable. Just make sure that the conservation is protected. At the same time that they should be out there working, getting the fishery industry, native industry. I think that's a great thing. Overall society, it'll be fantastic when we look back 20 years. Like, subscribe and have a good day.